On a cold day in early December, a simple request landed on a deputy's desk. Go check on a little girl in Oakville, Washington. Not a runaway, not a teenager avoiding school, a 4-year-old, a child who should have been easy to locate, at home, at a relative's, with a babysitter, anywhere that made sense. But when law enforcement asked the people who were supposed to know exactly where she was, the answers didn't add up. And as investigators pressed for proof that Oakley Carlson was safe, a more frightening question began to take shape, one that still hangs over this case years later. How does a child vanish so completely that even the basics, when she was last seen, who saw her, and why no one reported her missing, turn into a maze of contradictions? And in a small community where people notice what's normal and what isn't, how did the absence of one little girl go on for so long before authorities were called? This is the story of Oakley Carlson, the timeline that investigators can prove, the timeline they can't, and the uncomfortable space in between, where family secrecy, system limitations, and missing answers collide. If you're here for cases that don't get wrapped up in a neat headline, cases that force you to sit with uncertainty, while still demanding accountability, consider subscribing. We go deep, we stay respectful, and we follow the facts as far as they'll go, because what you're about to hear isn't just one family's mystery. It's a test of how well the people and institutions around a child can recognize danger before it's too late. Oakville is the kind of place where your surroundings can feel both comforting and isolating at the same time. It's rural, quiet, the kind of community where you learn patterns, who takes which road home, who shows up at the same gas station, which kids are always together. In towns like that, people don't just notice what happens. They notice what stops happening. And the first thing to understand about Oakley is that, for a significant part of her early life, adults were already making decisions about where she should live and what safe looked like for her. According to public reporting and advocacy around the case, Oakley spent time in foster care beginning in 2017 and was returned to her biological parents in 2019. That's not a minor detail, it's the foundation underneath everything that came later, because it means more than one set of adults loved her, worried about her, and believed they were responsible for her well-being. In one home, Oakley was a foster child, the kind of little kid who would have had routines built around her, bedtime stories, daycare schedules, tiny shoes lined up by the door, drawings that end up taped to the fridge. In another home, she returned to her biological family, a reunification that, on paper, represents hope, parents doing what courts and agencies asked of them, a child going back to the people who brought her into the world. Reunification is supposed to be the moment when a system proves it can do two things at once: preserve families and protect children. But those two goals don't always move in the same direction. And in Oakley's case, the tension between them became part of the mystery. Because the next provable milestone in this story isn't a birthday party photo, or the first day of preschool, or a neighbor remembering her riding a bike down a gravel road. The next major anchor point investigators have publicly talked about is much darker. The last credible time Oakley was seen by someone outside her immediate household. According to reporting that cites the Grays Harbor County Sheriff's Office, the last credible sighting of Oakley Carlson was February 10, 2021. The key phrase there is credible, and the key limitation is by someone other than her parents. It suggests something investigators face in some of the hardest missing child cases. The timeline is only as solid as the witness is willing and able to confirm it. And once that credible sighting passes, the story becomes less about where Oakley went and more about the silence that followed. Because in a normal world, a 4-year-old has a paper trail, doctor's appointments, school events, a trip to the store where someone pinches their cheeks and says they're getting so big. But in this case, the public record points to the opposite. Fewer sightings, fewer confirmations, and fewer people outside the home who could say with confidence, "Yes, I saw her. I know she was alive and well." This is where the case demands that we slow down and stay careful. There are allegations, rumors, and theories that have swirled around Oakley's disappearance for years. Some of them are so extreme they can pull attention away from what actually matters: verified facts and accountable questions. So as we move forward, here's the standard we're going to use. Confirmed means it's grounded in official statements, court records, or documented reporting tied to those sources. Alleged means someone claimed it in court filings or investigators reported it as part of an inquiry, but it has not been proven in a trial about Oakley's disappearance. Unknown means it's a gap, something the public wants answered, but the record doesn't provide. And the biggest unknown in this case is painfully simple: where is Oakley Carlson? Now, to understand why a school principal became one of the most important early voices in this investigation, we need to jump forward to late 2021. Public reporting describes a fire at the family's residence in November 2021. Fires do something to a community. They trigger response. They draw people in. They create a reason for neighbors and local leaders to show up with help: clothes, food, blankets, rides, a place to stay. They also create a reason for someone to see what's going on inside a household, sometimes for the first time in a long time. And in this case, one of the adults who showed up was connected to Oakley's sister through school. The principal's role, based on publicly reported accounts, is not that of an investigator. It's the role of someone who notices children, someone who listens, someone who recognizes when something feels wrong, even if they can't articulate exactly why. The principal visited, reportedly offered assistance, and what stood out wasn't a confession or a dramatic moment. It was an absence. Oakley wasn't there, and when adults asked about her, the explanations, at least as later described in public case summaries, did not result in Oakley appearing in the doorway, shy and sleepy, clutching a blanket, proving that everything was fine. Here's the crucial point: Oakley was not reported missing by her parents. The report that ultimately triggered a welfare check came from outside the household. According to multiple published accounts, including reporting that cites law enforcement, a concerned citizen asked authorities to check on Oakley in early December 2021. And once that welfare check happened, the situation escalated fast because Oakley still wasn't produced. Not at the home, not at the temporary place the family was staying after the fire, not at a relative's house with contact information that could be verified on the spot. According to the Washington State Office of the Family and Children's Ombuds, publicly reported information included that law enforcement declared Oakley missing after a child welfare check in December 2021, and that Oakley's parents had no explanation for her disappearance, stating the last time they saw her was November 30th, 2021. That date matters because it's a second timeline claim, separate from the last credible sighting in February, and it shows you immediately why this case is so difficult. If investigators say the last credible sighting outside the home is in February 2021, and the parents say they last saw her in late November 2021, there's a massive, dangerous gap between those statements. Either Oakley was alive for months without any credible sightings by outsiders, or the timeline being offered by the people closest to her can't be trusted, or the public doesn't yet have access to evidence that clarifies what happened in between. And at this point in the story, I want to ask you something, not to sensationalize this, but because it matters. When you hear last credible sighting, and you hear parents didn't report her missing, what's your first instinct about the most likely explanation? Do you think this is a case of concealment, a tragic accident covered up, or something else entirely? Drop your early theory in the comments, and as we go, see if your theory survives the facts. Because the next step for investigators in a case like this is standard and heartbreaking. Verify the child's existence through evidence and witnesses, establish the last known movements, and search for any sign that the child is still in the environment where they're supposed to be. In reporting about the case, investigators have said they were treating the circumstances as suspicious. They also publicly identified Oakley's biological parents as persons of interest in her disappearance. That phrase matters. A person of interest is not the same as someone convicted. It signals attention and suspicion, not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And in Oakley's case, years have passed without criminal charges filed specifically for her disappearance, which underscores just how hard it can be to build a case when a body is not recovered and when direct witnesses don't provide usable information. Meanwhile, something else was happening in parallel. The legal system was addressing dangers to other children in the same household. In 2022, Oakley's father, Andrew Carlson, was sentenced in a child endangerment case involving other children, not Oakley's disappearance. Reporting described him pleading guilty to felony counts of child endangerment with a controlled substance and receiving a 12-month sentence. Those details don't solve Oakley's disappearance, but they do frame the environment around the investigation. Law enforcement and the courts were finding evidence that other children were placed at serious risk in that home. And in cases like this, that's where the story can become distorted in the public mind. People hear about convictions involving other children, and they want that to be the same as a conviction for what happened to Oakley. They want the system to say out loud, "This is what happened, and this is who did it." But the law doesn't work that way. Suspicion and even moral certainty do not equal prosecutable proof. And the absence of a charge doesn't mean investigators stop caring. It often means they're stuck between what they believe and what they can prove. As Oakley's case stayed unresolved, the community response didn't fade. In fact, it grew. Her former foster parent, Jamie Jo Hiles, became one of the most visible advocates connected to the case, pushing to keep Oakley's name in the public eye, raising money for a reward, and calling attention to perceived failures in the child welfare system. Reporting in 2024 described the reward reaching $100,000 and tied that effort to broader activism around the Department of Children, Youth and Families, DCYF, and proposed reforms. That advocacy matters for two reasons. First, because missing children's cases can go quiet without constant attention, especially in small towns far from national media hubs. Second, because Oakley's story sits at the intersection of two worlds, criminal investigation and child welfare policy. One is about what happened to Oakley. The other is about how Oakley's life became vulnerable in the first place. So let's talk about that second world for a moment, because it's easy to misunderstand it. In September 2022, the Washington State Office of the Family and Children's Ombuds released an investigation report regarding Oakley Carlson. The Ombuds is an oversight agency meant to evaluate whether DCYF actions followed laws, policies, and court orders. That report is careful about what it can say publicly, because child welfare records are protected by confidentiality laws. But the report still reveals something important. The rules around transparency are different when a child is missing versus when a child is officially declared deceased. The report explains that child fatality reviews, public-facing documents that can bring details into the light, are only conducted under specific legal conditions, and that unless a child is officially declared deceased, cases of a missing child under suspicious circumstances do not meet the legal requirements permitting a child fatality review. That's one of those sentences that can feel cold until you understand what it means in practice. It means the public can be desperate for answers, and the state can still be legally limited in what it can disclose. It also means that the kind of systemic review that often follows the worst outcomes can be delayed by the very uncertainty that defines a missing person case. The Ombuds report also stated that, after reviewing records and conducting interviews, it found DCYF's actions in Oakley's case were consistent with laws, policies, and court orders, while also identifying opportunities to improve services, particularly around preserving and strengthening the parent-child bond through what it calls family time, meaning visitation. To some people, that conclusion reads like vindication for the system. To others, it reads like a devastating bureaucratic shield. The idea that a child can disappear, and yet the agencies involved can still be found compliant with policy. Both reactions can be emotionally understandable, but neither reaction answers the central question. Policy compliance is not the same as safety, and safety is not the same as truth. And that brings us back to the investigation. Because while agencies debated processes and advocates debated reform, detectives still had to do the same thing they do in every missing child case. Find the child, or find enough evidence to prove what happened to the child, and then prove who is responsible. According to reporting tied to law enforcement statements, investigators have treated Oakley's disappearance as a possible homicide and have worked with prosecutors as the case continued. Again, language matters. Possible is not proven. Working with prosecutors is not the same as filing charges. It signals a direction and a seriousness that goes beyond a simple missing person file. But in the public's eye, Oakley's case remained frozen in a painful in-between. No confirmed sightings, no confirmed recovery, no criminal resolution. And then, in 2025, another development entered the story, one that many families of missing people eventually face, and one that can feel both practical and unbearable. According to reporting citing court records, Oakley Carlson was declared legally dead in August 2025 in a probate case in Pacific County Superior Court. There was no major press announcement tied to that update, and public reporting noted that details about the ruling were limited. People hearing the news reacted the way you might expect, with confusion, shock, anger, and grief that had nowhere clear to land, because legally dead is not the same thing as case solved. It is, in many situations, a legal mechanism, something families pursue so they can handle estates, benefits, custody arrangements, and paperwork that becomes impossible when a person is missing on paper forever. It can also, psychologically, feel like a line drawn in ink across a space where hope used to be. But from an investigative standpoint, a legal declaration does not equal proof of what happened. It doesn't identify a cause. It doesn't identify a perpetrator. It doesn't establish a timeline. What it can do, however, is change the way systems respond, because now the child is, officially, in a category where certain reviews and disclosures may become possible under the law in ways they weren't before. That's why, in this case, the Ombuds report's discussion of child fatality reviews is so relevant. For years, Oakley's disappearance existed in a legal gray zone, deeply suspicious, widely believed to be tragic, but not officially classified the way a confirmed death would be. A legal declaration can shift that landscape. And yet, even with that shift, Oakley is still missing in the way that matters most. No one has publicly presented a definitive account of what happened to her, and no one has been charged with a crime for her disappearance. So what do we do with a story like this? One where the public has pieces, the authorities have pieces, and the center is still empty. We build the timeline as carefully as we can, and we acknowledge what we don't know. Here's what public reporting and official statements have consistently pointed to. Oakley Carlson was born in December 2016. She was a small child when she entered foster care, and she was still small when she returned to her biological parents. She was 4 years old during the last period when investigators say she was seen alive by someone outside her parents' direct care. Her last credible sighting outside the household has been reported as February 10, 2021. Her disappearance was not reported by her parents. It was reported months later, in early December 2021, after a concerned citizen pushed for a welfare check. According to the Ombuds's report, law enforcement said Oakley's parents did not have an explanation for her disappearance and claimed they last saw her on November 30, 2021. Those are the anchors, and when you place them on a calendar, the story becomes terrifying in its simplicity. A child is last credibly seen in February, and the case doesn't reach law enforcement as a missing child until December. That's not a gap that happens by accident, not in a world where children are enrolled in school, seen by doctors, or photographed at birthdays. A gap like that suggests isolation, concealment, neglect, or a breakdown in the normal social networks that would otherwise notice a missing kid. And as investigators dug in, the case didn't just raise questions about where Oakley was. It raised questions about what the people around her were told, and why. One of the most haunting elements, as reported in public accounts, is the idea that Oakley's siblings were told not to talk about her, and that when asked, explanations ranged from "she's with foster parents" to more alarming statements attributed to what a child said they'd been told. It's hard to hear, and it's important to handle responsibly. Children repeat what adults say. Children also misunderstand and dramatize. But in the context of a missing child investigation, statements like that become signals, clues that reflect the emotional climate inside a household. Because if a child believes they're not allowed to speak a sibling's name, that is not a normal family dynamic. That's secrecy being taught. That's fear being enforced. And even if those statements are only partially accurate, they can still point investigators toward the same core concern. The adults who had control over Oakley's life may have been controlling the narrative of her absence as well. At this point, the case splits into two tracks that never fully rejoin in public. Track 1 is what law enforcement has done: searches, interviews, evidence collection, coordination with prosecutors, repeated public appeals for information, and the maintenance of an active investigation long after headlines moved on. Track 2 is what the courts have done in related matters, charging and convicting Oakley's parents in separate cases involving the safety of other children, and later prosecuting other crimes not directly tied to Oakley's disappearance. Those tracks matter because they reveal a pattern often seen in child-focused investigations. Authorities may not have enough evidence to file the biggest charge, the one the public wants, so they use what they can prove to restrict access to children, impose supervision, or remove kids from dangerous environments. It's not satisfying, it's not closure, but sometimes it's the only immediate tool available. Now let's talk about what a person of interest status means for you as a viewer and for the broader public. It means investigators have reasons to focus on someone, but those reasons may include things that are not admissible in court. It may include tips, inconsistencies, behavior, or evidence that is still being tested. It may also include the simple fact that, statistically, a child who disappears under suspicious circumstances is most often harmed by someone close to them, not a stranger. But most often is not always. That's why responsible coverage has to stay disciplined. The public can apply pressure. The public can demand transparency and accountability. But the public should not declare guilt as fact when the justice system has not proven it. In this case, law enforcement has publicly described Oakley's parents as persons of interest, and public reporting has described them as uncooperative with the investigation. At the same time, years have passed without charges filed for Oakley's disappearance. That combination creates an emotional trap, the urge to fill the silence with certainty. We're not going to do that. What we can do is ask the questions that remain unanswered and explain why they matter. First, why was Oakley returned to her biological parents in 2019? That question sits at the center of the reform conversations around this case. It's also the question that the Ombuds's report indirectly addresses by explaining the legal and procedural framework around reunification, reasonable efforts, safety assessments, and post-reunification supervision. The report emphasizes that reunification decisions are based on compliance with services and court orders, and that the department's actions were consistent with laws and policies. But the human question is different from the policy question. The human question is, did the system correctly evaluate whether compliance equaled safety? Second, what happened between February and December 2021? This is the black box. If the last credible sighting outside the home is in February, What explains the absence of confirmed contact afterward? Was Oakley pulled from public life? Were there missed reports? Were there people who saw her but didn't realize the significance? Or was something else happening that made it impossible for anyone to see her because she was already gone? Third, why wasn't Oakley reported missing by her parents? Even in households struggling with instability, children get missed. People ask questions. Schools notice absences. Doctors notice missed checkups. If a parent truly doesn't know where a 4-year-old is, the urgency is immediate. In this case, the report came from outside the home, which is one of the strongest signals investigators can receive that the adults closest to the child may be hiding something. Fourth, what evidence exists that the public hasn't seen? If detectives are working with prosecutors on a possible homicide case, that suggests there may be evidence beyond what's publicly disclosed. But confidentiality, investigative integrity, and the need to protect minors can all limit what authorities can release. And that leads to a fifth question, one that's as much about the future as it is about the past. What does justice look like for Oakley Carlson if her remains are never found? For some families, justice is a conviction. For others, it's the truth. For others, it's reform, preventing the next child from becoming a headline. In Oakley's case, the answer may involve all three. If you're finding yourself pulled deeper into this story, if you're thinking, how did this go on so long? A like helps more people discover these cases, which keeps pressure on the systems that can't be allowed to forget them. Now let's keep going, because the next part of this story is where the timeline and the system collide. When the Ombuds report explains why a child fatality review can't occur unless a child is officially declared deceased, it exposes a grim reality. The law sometimes requires certainty before it allows public accountability mechanisms to activate, even when the circumstances are screaming for scrutiny. That's not just a bureaucratic issue. It affects the public narrative. It affects what journalists can confirm. It affects what advocates can prove. And it can create a vacuum where misinformation thrives. In that vacuum, theories emerge. Some people have suggested Oakley was sold, trafficked, or hidden. Others believe something happened in the home and was covered up. Still others think she may have wandered away, though law enforcement has emphasized suspicious circumstances and the lack of credible evidence supporting an accidental disappearance. In public reporting, investigators have weighed in on theories, sometimes addressing them directly. But the core remains unchanged. Oakley has not been found. The fact that a large reward exists, and that it grew over time, also speaks to a reality families learn quickly in missing person cases. Tips can slow down as time passes. Memories fade. People move away. And sometimes, the person who knows the truth is not motivated by conscience. They're motivated by leverage, money, immunity, or the fear that someone else will talk first. That's why rewards exist. They aren't just incentives. They're acknowledgments of how difficult human behavior can be when the stakes are high. And when a reward reaches 6 figures, it does something else too. It keeps the case visible. It tells anyone holding information, this is not going away. Meanwhile, the legal developments around Oakley's parents have continued to draw attention, even when those developments were not directly about Oakley. And that's where another ethical line has to be drawn. It's fair to report that Oakley's parents were convicted in unrelated cases involving child endangerment. It's fair to report sentencing and the court's restrictions, because those are public matters. But it is not fair to use those convictions as proof of what happened to Oakley. They are context. They are part of the environment. They are not the solution. The same goes for later crimes attributed to Oakley's mother, Jordan Bowers, in identity theft cases reported in local news. Those details may matter for understanding patterns and stability, but they do not prove what happened to Oakley. So instead of turning this into a story about sensational villains, we need to turn it back into what it actually is: a missing child, a stalled timeline, and a community trying to force answers into the light. Because the most important person in this story isn't a suspect. It isn't a judge. It isn't an advocate. It's Oakley, a little girl who should be in school now, with a backpack that's too big for her shoulders and a favorite snack she begs for at the store. A little girl who, if she were alive, would have grown into a new face. Exactly why age progression images exist. Because the passage of time changes what we can recognize, but it doesn't change who we're searching for. When authorities released age progression images, they were acknowledging that reality. Oakley's last publicly available photos were from years earlier, and people needed help imagining what she might look like now. That's not a media stunt. It's one of the few tools investigators and organizations like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children can offer when time becomes an enemy. Now, let's return to the moment the public first learned Oakley was missing. In early December 2021, a welfare check is requested. Law enforcement attempts to locate Oakley. She isn't produced. The parents' explanations, according to public reporting and the Ombuds report, do not result in Oakley being found. What happens next in many missing child cases is a rapid escalation, searches, interviews, and a shift from missing to suspicious. That shift is not just emotional, it changes investigative tactics. It can trigger specialized resources. It can change how people are questioned. And it can change how prosecutors begin to think about what might eventually be charged. The public doesn't always see those steps, but we can infer certain realities. Investigators would have wanted to know the last time anyone outside the household saw Oakley. They would have wanted to know where Oakley slept, what she ate, what clothes she owned, what toys she loved. They would have wanted to see proof that Oakley lived there recently, not years ago. Because when a child is missing, their environment tells a story. If a child's belongings are present and current, it suggests recent presence. If there's no space for them, no recent clothes, no signs of daily care, it raises a different kind of alarm, one that suggests the child has been absent long enough for the household to function without acknowledging them. In public case summaries, reports have described investigators finding no evidence that Oakley had been living in the home recently. Those details, when reported, became part of why the case was widely considered suspicious early on. And then there's the question of the fire in November 2021. In some accounts, questions were raised about the circumstances of the fire and about the family's actions afterward. Fires are chaotic. People make decisions under stress. But investigators also look at fires differently when a child is missing and when a fire appears in the timeline close to the date the parents claim they last saw the child. This is where the case becomes almost impossible for the public to fully grasp, because we don't have all of the investigative material. We have fragments, statements, dates, charges in other cases, and the consistent fact that Oakley is not located. So the best we can do is keep tightening the questions. If the parents claim they last saw Oakley on November 30th, 2021, as cited in the Ombuds report, then where was Oakley between that date and the welfare check? Who saw her? Where did she sleep? What did she eat? Why wasn't she in school? Why weren't there witnesses? If investigators say the last credible sighting was February 10th, 2021, then what explains the months in between? Who had access to Oakley? Who could confirm she was alive during that period? And if a legal declaration of death occurs in 2025, what does that say about the practical realities the family and community faced? That they were forced legally to acknowledge what investigators may have believed for years, that Oakley is unlikely to be found alive. Now I want to ask a second comment question, because this is the point where people split emotionally. When you hear that a missing child has been declared legally dead while the criminal investigation is still ongoing, do you see it as a necessary legal step, or do you feel like it risks reducing urgency? Put your reaction in the comments, because your answer says a lot about how people understand missing person cases, and how systems can unintentionally shape public attention. For investigators, the declaration changes less than you might think. If they believed Oakley was harmed, they were already working with that assumption operationally. What changes is the administrative world around the case, and potentially the kinds of reviews and public reporting that can occur. But even that is not automatic. The Ombuds report highlighted confidentiality constraints, and those constraints often remain even after death declarations, depending on statutes and case specifics. So where does that leave us today? Public reporting indicates the case remains active. Advocacy remains active. Law enforcement continues to renew requests for information. The reward exists. Age progression images exist. And Oakley's name continues to be spoken, often by people who never met her, but who understand the kind of case this is, the kind that can disappear into the background unless someone refuses to let it. And that brings us to the hardest part of telling this story, the emotional truth without false certainty. We can't tell you what happened to Oakley as fact, because the public record does not contain a proven account. We can't tell you who harmed her as fact, because no one has been convicted in relation to her disappearance. We can't tell you what evidence investigators have collected behind closed doors. We can't tell you what a prosecutor believes they can prove. But we can tell you what the timeline suggests. It suggests that Oakley was absent from public life for an extended period. It suggests that adults in her immediate world did not provide a clear, verifiable explanation for her whereabouts when authorities asked. It suggests that the environment around her was unstable enough that courts later imposed serious consequences related to other children's safety. It suggests that, for years, the case has remained in a category where suspicion is high and proof is difficult. And it suggests that, in small towns and in systems built on paperwork and limited resources, children can slip into invisibility, especially when the people responsible for them refuse to let outsiders see what's happening. If you take nothing else from this case, take that. A child doesn't just go missing. A child becomes easier to hide when fewer people see them, when fewer people ask questions, when fewer people have regular access, and when the institutions meant to check in are constrained, overloaded, or limited by what they can legally disclose. That's why community members matter. That's why teachers and principals matter. That's why neighbors matter. And that's why cases like Oakley's aren't just tragedies, they're warnings. Now, I want to bring the focus back to Oakley one more time, because it's easy to lose her in the machinery of agencies and courts. Oakley was not a symbol when she was born. She wasn't a bill name. She wasn't a headline. She was a little girl in Washington State, growing up in a world she didn't choose, depending on adults to do the things kids can't do for themselves, make safe choices, show up consistently, and protect her when life got complicated. And if you've ever known a 4-year-old, you know how small 4 really is. 4-year-olds are still learning the rules of the world. They still believe adults are truthful because they need to. They still accept punishment as something they must have earned because they don't have the power to reject it. Which is why allegations about confinement, neglect, or secrecy, when they appear in public discourse, hit people so hard. Not because they're salacious, but because they point to a child being treated as less than human inside the place that should be safest. In later years, some reporting referenced court documents describing allegations of severe mistreatment. Those allegations are not a conviction for Oakley's disappearance, and they are not proof of what happened. But they help explain why the public reacted the way it did, because even the possibility is almost unbearable. And still, the case remains open. So what could move it forward? In many long-running missing person investigations, breakthroughs come from one of 3 things. 1. Someone who has stayed silent decides to talk. That might be a person close to the household. It might be a friend. It might be someone who heard an offhand comment years ago and didn't realize its significance until later. 2. A piece of physical evidence is discovered, sometimes by accident, sometimes during unrelated work, sometimes because land changes and reveals what was hidden. 3. Investigators develop a prosecutable theory without a body, using circumstantial evidence, digital traces, financial records, or witness statements strong enough to survive defense challenges. We don't know which path Oakley's case will take, or if it will take one at all. But we do know what detectives have asked for repeatedly: information. If someone knows where Oakley is, or what happened to her, the passage of time does not reduce the seriousness of that knowledge. It increases it, because every year of silence is another year without accountability, and another year without dignity for a child who deserved better. And that's why the reward matters. That's why the billboards and campaigns matter. That's why repeated statements matter. They're not noise. They're pressure. Now here's the 3rd comment prompt, because this is the moment where I think viewers confront the deepest dilemma. If you were a prosecutor looking at this case, what would you prioritize first? Pursuing charges without remains if you believe the evidence was strong enough, or waiting for a discovery that could eliminate doubt in the jury's mind? Tell me how you'd approach it, because the answer reveals the trade-off that families live with: speed versus certainty. There's one more thread in this story we need to address, and it's the one people argue about the most: the system. When advocates talk about DCYF and foster care, what they're often wrestling with is something that can be true in the same breath. Parents can deserve support and a chance to reunify, and children can still be harmed if reunification is pursued without enough safeguards. The Ombuds's report makes clear that the system is bound by laws, court orders, and timelines. It explains that permanency planning is designed to prevent children from lingering in foster care indefinitely, and that the decision to return a child home is tied to compliance, assessments, and structured meetings. It also emphasizes post-reunification supervision requirements for young children. And then it concludes that the department's actions were consistent with laws, policies, and court orders, while still recommending improvements, particularly around the quality and resourcing of family time, and around focusing not only on service compliance, but on bonding and attachment. If you read that carefully, you can see why people on different sides can look at the same document and feel completely different emotions. Someone can read consistent with laws and feel anger, because to them the outcome proves the laws weren't enough. Someone else can read it and feel defensiveness, because they see social workers and judges forced to make decisions with imperfect information, limited options, and competing obligations. Both viewpoints can contain truth, but neither changes what matters most: Oakley is missing. So the real lesson isn't just the system failed, or the system followed policy. The real lesson is that following policy is not the same thing as preventing tragedy, and if policy can lead to tragedy, then policy needs to change. That's why legislation bearing Oakley's name became part of the story. In Washington, a proposal known as the Oakley Carlson Act was introduced in 2023. Public bill summaries show it was heard but retained in its status, reflecting how difficult it can be to move reforms from public emotion into enacted law. And that's the final frustrating layer in this case. Even when a child's story becomes national, reform is slow. Investigations are slow. Courts are slow. and families, whether biological, foster, or extended, are left carrying the weight of time. Which brings us to the peak reality in this story, the part that hits hardest because it's both concrete and incomplete. In August 2025, Oakley Carlson was declared legally dead by a court, according to reporting citing court records. That means that, in the eyes of the state, the legal world is now permitted to treat her as deceased for certain purposes. It is, effectively, the paperwork version of what many people feared had been true for years. But there is a difference between being declared dead and being brought home. Oakley's disappearance remains unresolved. No one has been charged with a crime in relation to her disappearance. Her parents remain persons of interest in law enforcement reporting, but that status has not translated into a conviction or a publicly resolved narrative of what happened. So if you were hoping for the kind of ending true crime sometimes delivers, a confession, a dramatic arrest, a trial where the truth spills out, you don't get that here. Not yet. What you get instead is the shape of a tragedy that refuses to become neat. A little girl last credibly seen in early 2021. A report months later triggered by a concerned adult outside the home. Parents offering explanations that did not produce the child. A long investigation that hasn't found her. A community that refuses to let her name disappear. A legal declaration that acknowledges the worst without explaining it. And the quietest, most painful line underneath all of it, Oakley should have been protected. If you've made it this far, I want to end with a final comment prompt. Not a theory question, but a reflection. When you look at this case, what do you think is the single most important safeguard that could prevent another child from slipping out of sight like this? More frequent welfare checks, stronger post-reunification monitoring, school-based reporting tools, or something else entirely? Leave your answer below. Not because a comment fixes anything, but because this is how public pressure forms. One person naming what must change, and then another person agreeing. Oakley Carlson was born in December 2016. She was a small child when adults decided where she would live. She was 4 years old when the last credible sighting outside her home was reported. And she is still missing in the way that matters most, even after a court declared her legally dead. If you know anything that could help, contact the Grays Harbor County Sheriff's Office. Tips that seem small can be the piece that finally makes a timeline real. And if you want to keep going with cases like this, cases that require patience, care, and a commitment to truth over theatrics, consider subscribing. Oakley's story deserves more than a headline, and the only way cases like hers stay visible is if people keep watching, keep sharing, and keep asking the question that no one has been able to answer yet. Where is Oakley Carlson?